There are few stories that are as haunting and controversial as that of Anneliese Michel. It's a tale that seems ripped from the pages of Gothic horror. A young woman in 1970s Germany, supposedly possessed by demons, undergoes nearly 70 exorcisms before tragically dying at the age of 23. The case would go on to inspire the film The Exorcism of Emily Rose and spark heated debates about the intersection of faith, medicine, and the power of belief. What if I told you the story you think you know, the one that's been sensationalized in movies and tabloids, might be built on a foundation of misunderstandings, cultural biases, and perhaps even willful ignorance? And yet, what if there's still a kernel of truth at its core, one that speaks to deeper issues of mental health, religious fervor, and the human need for meaning in the face of suffering? Let's start at the beginning. Anneliese Michel was born in 1952 in Bavaria. By all accounts, she grew up in a devoutly Catholic family known for their strict adherence to religious practices. And this detail is crucial because it's going to set the stage for how Anneliese and her family would later interpret her experiences. In 1969, when she was 16 years old, she experienced her first epileptic seizure. And this is where our story takes its first significant turn. In today's medical landscape, epilepsy is a well-understood neurological condition. But in 1960s rural Germany, especially in deeply religious communities, there was still a lingering association between seizures and demonic possession. It's essential to pause here and consider the historical context. The idea of epilepsy as a form of spiritual affliction dates back to ancient times. The Greeks called it the sacred disease. In many cultures, the convulsions and altered states of consciousness associated with seizures was seen as evidence of supernatural forces at work. So when Anneliese begins experiencing these frightening and inexplicable episodes, it's not entirely surprising that her family and community might lean towards supernatural explanations. But here's where things get complicated. She wasn't immediately diagnosed with epilepsy. In fact, her initial medical examinations were inconclusive. She was treated for possibly psychiatric issues, including depression, and it wasn't until 1970 that a neurologist officially diagnosed her with grand mal epilepsy. Now let's consider what was happening in her life during this time. She was a teenager dealing with the frightening and stigmatizing medical condition. She was living in a conservative religious community that might view her condition with suspicion. She was being given powerful medication that, while intended to help, often came with significant side effects. So is it any wonder that Anneliese might have struggled psychologically as well as physically? As her condition worsened, so did her behavior. She began to display symptoms that her family and local priests interpreted as signs of demonic possession. She was reported to speak in strange, guttural voices. She showed an aversion to religious objects. She engaged in self-harm and displayed extreme mood swings. Now, to our modern ears, many of these symptoms sound like they could be explained by a combination of epilepsy, mental health issues, and the side effects of strong anti-epileptic medication. But to Anneliese's family and the priests involved in her case, these were clear signs of demonic influence. And this is where we need to go into the power of belief and suggestion. When people are primed to see demonic activity, they often interpret ambiguous events or behaviors through that lens. It's a phenomenon psychologists call confirmation bias. We tend to notice and emphasize evidence that will already confirm our pre-existing beliefs while downplaying or ignoring contradictory evidence. But here's where the story takes another turn. Despite her family's religious interpretations, Anneliese continued to receive medical treatment alongside the growing religious interventions. She was hospitalized several times and prescribed various medications. And this dual approach, medical and spiritual, would continue throughout her whole ordeal. In 1975, convinced that Anneliese was possessed, her family sought the help of Ernst, a local priest who believed in the reality of demonic possession. Alt in turn petitioned the local bishop for permission to perform an exorcism. Now, this is a crucial point. In the Catholic Church, exorcisms are not performed lightly. They require the approval of a bishop and are supposed to be undertaken only after medical explanations have been ruled out. The bishop granted permission, and in September 1975, the exorcisms began. And over the next 10 months, Anneliese would undergo nearly 70 exorcism sessions, sometimes lasting up to 4 hours. Now let's pause and consider the physical and psychological toll that takes on a person. Anneliese, already struggling with epilepsy, possibly other health issues, is subjected to grueling ritual sessions. She was often restrained, she was fasted frequently, all of this while still supposedly taking her epilepsy medication. And that is a recipe for disaster. And tragically, that's exactly what happened on July 1st, 1976. She died. The official cause of her death? Malnutrition and dehydration. She weighed just 68 pounds. The aftermath of Anneliese's death was as controversial as her life. Her parents and the 2 priests involved in the exorcism were put on trial for negligent homicide. The case became a media sensation with public opinion sharply divided. Some saw it as a tragic case of medical neglect masked by religious fervor. Others viewed it as a spiritual battle that the secular world couldn't understand. The court found the defendants guilty, though they received suspended sentences. The verdict seemed to acknowledge the complexity of the case, a recognition that while mistakes were made, they were born out of sincere but misguided beliefs. But here's where we need to dig deeper. The easy narrative is to cast this as a simple conflict between faith and science, between medieval superstition and modern medicine, but the reality is far more nuanced and in many ways more tragic. Consider the role of culture and education. Anneliese and her family lived in a world where demonic possession was still seen as a real and present danger. Their interpretation of her symptoms wasn't just a product of individual belief, but of a broader cultural context. Then there's the question of medical care. While Anneliese did receive some medical treatment, it's clear that it was inadequate. But was this solely due to religious interference? Or did it also reflect the limitations of epilepsy treatment in 1970s rural Germany? It's worth noting that even today, epilepsy can be challenging to treat effectively, often requiring a more trial and error approach with medications. And then we also need to consider the power of the placebo effect and its dark twin, the nocebo effect. If Anneliese believed she was possessed, could this belief been exacerbated by her symptoms? There's ample evidence in medical literature of the power of belief to influence physical symptoms. But perhaps the most compelling angle of this story is what it tells us about the human need for meaning in the face of suffering. Anneliese's family, and perhaps herself, found a kind of purpose in the idea of spiritual warfare. It offered a framework for understanding the suffering she was going through, and in some ways, more comforting than the random cruelty of a medical condition. This is not to excuse the tragic mishandling of Anneliese's care, but it does help us understand how intelligent, caring people could make decisions that in hindsight seem obviously wrong. So where does this leave us? Was Anneliese Michel truly possessed by demons? Possibly. Was she a victim of medical neglect and religious hysteria? Or was she caught in a perfect storm of cultural belief, medical limitations, and psychological distress? The reality, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the middle. Anneliese was clearly a troubled young woman, struggling with a serious medical condition in a cultural context that was ill-equipped to properly understand or treat it. And the framework of demonic possession, whether it played a part or not, provided a way to conceptualize her suffering, but ultimately led tragically to her death. But in focusing solely on the question of whether Anneliese was really possessed, we risk missing the larger and more intriguing story. This is a tale about the power of belief, the limitations of medical knowledge, and the way societies construct their narratives around suffering and evil. It's also a story about the complex interplay between faith, science, and culture. The case of Anneliese Michel challenges us to approach such stories with both compassion and critical thinking. It invites us to consider the complex nature of human experience where medical, psychological, cultural, and spiritual factors are often intertwined in ways that defy simplistic categorization. And perhaps the most valuable lesson we can take from the tragic case of Anneliese Michel is this. In matters of health, physical, mental, and spiritual, we need to strive for a holistic understanding. to be open to medical explanations without dismissing the power of belief in the spiritual realm. We must respect cultural and religious perspectives while also being willing to challenge those things that are harmful. And above all, remember that at the heart of cases like Anneliese's are real human beings, suffering, struggling, and deserving of our more careful and compassionate attention. So in the end, the story of Anneliese Michel is not just about exorcism or epilepsy. It's about the ongoing challenge of navigating the complex intersection of faith, science, and human experience. And it's a reminder that in our quest to understand and alleviate suffering, we have to remain open to multiple perspectives while always prioritizing the well-being of the individual. And so as we reflect on her story, we're left with a sobering realization. The demons we most need to exorcise might not be supernatural entities, but the demons of ignorance, fear, that can blind us to the complex realities of human suffering. And that exorcism is a task that requires not holy water or ancient rituals, but education, empathy, and humility. It's a willingness to grapple with the messy complexities of the human condition.